Before we step into the cold months of the Middle Ages, pause for just a moment. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it in your part of the world? As you listen, imagine the warmth of your room fading, the wind pressing against wooden walls, and winter tightening its grip on a medieval village. Tonight, we travel back to a world where surviving winter was not comfort, but courage, planning, and endurance. A biting wind howls through the bare trees, and dusk falls early over the medieval countryside. Villagers hurry to shutter their wooden huts as the last weak light of the sun disappears. In the distance, a wolf's mournful cry echoes across frozen fields. Winter in medieval Europe is a season of hardship and uncertainty, a time when the warmth of the harvest season feels like a distant memory and the promise of spring is still far off. Inside a humble cottage, a family gathers around a small hearth, its orange glow flickering against rough stone walls. The air smells of smoke and melting tallow from a simple candle. They wrap themselves in woolen blankets and cloaks, knowing that for the next several months, survival will depend on their preparations, their resourcefulness, and a bit of luck. Winter was more than just a change of weather. It was almost a state of being. In the medieval mindset, the season carried symbolic weight, often associated with old age, poverty, and death. The natural world had gone still and dormant. Fields lay fallow under frost, trees stood naked and dark, rivers slowed under sheets of ice. For those living in this era, winter meant a profound slowing down of daily life. The usual bustle of agricultural labor halted when snow and cold made work impractical. Shorter days and long nights forced people indoors early, gathering around hearth fires for light and warmth. Yet winter's hard cruelness, as one 13th century writer described it, also posed grave challenges. With houses poorly heated and insulated, every cold draught was a threat. Food stores had to last until spring, or hunger would set in. Travel became dangerous or impossible when heavy snow blocked roads. Each family's survival hung on the fruits of the previous year's toil, the grain in their bins, the vegetables in their cellar, the livestock in their pen. If the harvest had been poor, or the winter unusually harsh, the cold months could quickly turn deadly. Not every winter was equally severe, of course. In the High Middle Ages, Europe experienced some relatively mild winters during a period known as the medieval warm period. But by the 14th century, a cooling trend heralded the Little Ice Age, bringing colder, snowier winters on average. Year to year, people never knew what to expect. Some winters were merely long and gloomy, others were brutally cold, with blizzards that buried homes and froze rivers solid. Chroniclers tell of the winter of 1363-64, when the Rhine River froze for 70 days, and people even held a market on the ice. In Italy, that same era, snow fell so heavily that towns were cut off for days, and roofs collapsed under the weight. A rare sight in a region used to milder winters. These extreme tales circulated like grim legends, reminding everyone of nature's power. Yet, in the face of winter's hard cruelness, medieval people endured. They had to. Life depended on it. Over generations, they learned how to adapt their way of living when the world turned cold and dark. They timed their agricultural and household activities to the turning of the seasons, harvesting and preserving in autumn, conserving and rationing through winter, and praying for the return of warmth. Winter was a test of their preparations and their unity as a community. Neighbors might share tasks like slaughtering livestock or gathering firewood, knowing that cooperation could lighten the load for all. Around the hearth at night, families told stories or sang quietly, finding comfort in tradition and faith to carry them through the bleakest days. In this immersive journey, we will walk through a medieval winter month by month, from November's preparations to March's hopeful thaw. We'll explore how people in different parts of Europe, from the farms of England and France to the snowy villages of Scandinavia, survived and even found moments of celebration during winter. Each section will unveil the rhythms of rural life, the food they ate or went without, the warmth they managed to secure, the work that continued despite the cold, and the holy days that lifted their spirits. We will move slowly, in a calm and gentle pace, as though sitting beside the crackling fire with those medieval families, listening to the wind outside and feeling time slow down. Let the narrative carry you through the sights, sounds, and sensations of a long winter in the Middle Ages. A world lit by fire and starlight, where survival was an art, and every month brought new challenges and small consolations. Before we begin our month-by-month journey, imagine for a moment that you are in a medieval village on the cusp of winter. The last leaves have fallen from the oaks and elms. The fields are empty, the earth hardened with the first frosts. The scent of wood smoke hangs in the twilight air as each household lights its evening fire. There is a hush over the land, a quiet resignation and resolve. Winter has arrived, and with it comes a mix of fear and hope. Fear of the hunger and cold it brings, hope for the renewal that lies just beyond in spring. In that spirit, wrapped in furs and wool, let us step into November, where the story of medieval winter survival truly begins. November in medieval Europe was a month of strenuous activity and solemn preparation. As the days grew markedly shorter and the chill in the morning air became sharper, villagers knew that the threshold of winter had arrived. This was the time to finish all crucial tasks before the land fell into deep frost. In many regions, November was known as Blood Month, a name earned from the traditional slaughtering of livestock as winter approached. With grazing sparse and fodder limited, farmers could not afford to keep all their animals alive through the cold season. Instead, they butchered the pigs, cattle, goats, or sheep that would be too costly to feed, preserving their meat to sustain the family in the lean months ahead. The butchering usually peaked around Martinmas, November 11th, a date that marked the Feast of Street Martin and unofficially heralded the start of winter. By Martinmas, the last of the harvest was stored, and it was cool enough outside to cure meat without its spoiling. In farmyards and village commons, one might see busy scenes: hogs being led to slaughter, barrels of brine being prepared, and smokehouses readied to take on their essential work. From dawn till dusk, medieval peasants in November engaged in the laborious process of meat preservation. After an animal was slaughtered, its flesh was not simply eaten fresh. In fact, only a small portion might be cooked immediately as a fresh treat. The bulk had to be preserved to last all winter. Large cuts of beef, pork, mutton, and goat meat were soaked in strong brine for days, then hung up in the rafters of a smokehouse or over the cottage hearth to dry and absorb wood smoke. Smoking and salting drew out moisture and prevented rot, though it imparted a very salty taste. Some meats were pickled in vinegar brine or spiced wine, and thin strips might be dried into a form of jerky. Every part of the animal was used. Hides were set aside for leather, fat was rendered into lard for cooking, or tallow for candles. Bones were saved to make broth, glue, or tools, and even the blood was collected to make sausages and blood puddings. On slaughter day, nothing went to waste. Villagers turned the offal and organ meats into savory puddings and sausages mixed with onions, garlic, and herbs, seasonal delicacies to be eaten quickly, since those parts could not be preserved long. The fresh liver, heart, and kidneys might be cooked up in a stew that very night, shared piping hot to fortify everyone who had helped in the long day's butchery. When the fresh meat ran out in the following weeks, families would turn to their store of salted and smoked provisions. It wasn't especially pleasant fare. Heavily salted beef or mutton could be tough and needed to be simmered for hours in a cauldron to soften and reduce the salt. Thick pottage stews became the daily meal, a pot of water kept on the fire into which bits of dried meat, root vegetables, and grains were continually added and cooked. A chunk of smoked bacon was particularly prized. It could be chopped and thrown into the stew pot to lend some fatty richness and flavor to the otherwise bland grains and vegetables. Bacon from pigs was the preferred preserved meat of peasants, as pork absorbed less salt during curing and stayed more tender and moist than other meats. After slaughtering their pigs, families saved all the pork fat carefully. Some was rendered into lard for cooking, and a portion was made into tallow for dipping candles. The approach of winter meant longer nights, and those handmade tallow candles, though smoky and dim, would be vital for light. Thus, the slaughter of animals at Martinmas had a cascading benefit. It provided meat for food, fat for candles, and leather for shoes or flasks, helping the household survive the dark, cold months in multiple ways. Even as slaughtering and preserving meat went on, other preparations for winter were in full swing. November was the last call to gather any remaining food nature offered. In the woodlands, peasants released their pigs to enjoy the final weeks of pannage, feasting on acorns, beechnuts, and chestnuts on the forest floor. A farmer might knock acorns down from oak branches with a long stick, the pigs snuffling eagerly at his feet to gobble up the mast. This fattening of swine on forest forage was critical. Asterisk, asterisk. The more weight the pigs gained in November, the more food they would provide once butchered in winter. Often, a few pigs earmarked for December slaughter were still being fattened through this month. Meanwhile, villagers, young and old, combed the hedgerows and woods for the last wild berries and nuts of the year. They collected hazelnuts and walnuts to store the nuts with high in fat and protein, which could help stave off hunger in late winter. They gathered sloes, rosehips, and any lingering crabapples or wild plums, sources of vitamin C that might be brewed into a tart cider or preserved as a fruit paste. These forage treasures were small in quantity, but every little bit counted. In the garden plots, cold hardy vegetables were being harvested and tucked away. Medieval peasants cultivated coleworts, a broad term for cabbage family plants, like cabbages, kohlrabi, kale, and turnips, which could withstand frost. Come November, they pulled many of these from the ground. Sturdy cabbages and turnips were stored in root cellars or pits, often simply a hole dug into the cool earth, lined with straw. Some hearty vegetables were left right where they grew. One practice was to leave cabbages or turnips in the field and heap thick straw over them for insulation. Later, in midwinter, a farmer could dig through the snow and straw to retrieve a still edible cabbage, like finding a hidden morsel of green amidst the white landscape. Onions and garlic, harvested earlier, were already hanging in braids from rafters, and dried legumes, like peas and beans, were safely stored in clay jars. Grain from the autumn harvest, wheat, rye, barley, or oats, was now the cornerstone of the winter food supply. Much of it would be milled into flour or meal. Villagers brought sacks of grain to the local mill, if the watermill's wheel hadn't frozen yet, or ground it by hand with a quernstone as needed. The flour and meal were used to bake dense loaves of bread in the communal oven and to thicken pottage soups. They knew they must guard the grain stores carefully against damp and rats. A good barn cat was a valued ally in protecting the precious harvest from vermin. Aside from food preparations, November was filled with many chores to fortify homes and farmsteads for winter. Men repaired the thatch roofs of cottages and barns, climbing up to replace or secure the bundles of reeds so that rain and snow would shed off properly. Reeds and osiers, willow rods, were gathered from marshes to use not only for thatching roofs, but also for weaving baskets and fish traps. Women plastered cracks in cottage walls with fresh wattle and daub, smearing straw-reinforced mud to seal out draughts. They also took stock of winter clothing. Heavy woolen tunics, cloaks, and stockings were aired out and patched. Many an evening in late autumn, by the dim light of an oil lamp or tallow candle, a mother might be found spinning wool or nettle fibres into thread and knitting or weaving warm undergarments for her family. Nettle fibre, surprisingly, made a durable thread and was a handy substitute where flax or wool was scarce. The village cooper or carpenter would be checking wooden barrels and bins, ensuring they were watertight and rodent-proof for storing grain, salted meat, ale, and cider. Firewood had to be gathered in enormous quantities, for a household fire would need to burn day and night in winter. All through November, anyone with a cart made trips to nearby woodlands to collect allowed firewood. Lords often set rules forbidding peasants from cutting down live trees, so people scavenged fallen branches and dead wood, or they were permitted to prune a certain amount from living trees. By month's end, great stacks of logs and bundles of kindling were piled beside each house. If a family failed to lay in enough wood and charcoal, they risked spending the late winter nights shivering. There was a noticeable shift in the rhythm of life as November progressed. With the final field labours done and the slaughtering nearly complete, the village took on a quieter, more inward-focused air. People still laboured daily, but now much of the work moved indoors or to sheltered corners of the farm. In the late afternoons, one might walk through the lanes and catch the scent of curing meat mingling with wood smoke in the cold air. Cattle and goats that once grazed on open range had been brought into byres and barns for warmth. The muffled sounds of their lowing and bleating could be heard when you passed a byre door, and the farmers' children went out in the drizzling cold to carry them hay and fresh straw for bedding. By sunset, which in November might come as early as 4 o'clock, darkness fell swiftly, and the entire village seemed to vanish inside pools of flickering firelight. The medieval farmer, having finished a hearty but frugal supper of rye bread and vegetable pottage, would bank the hearth fire for the night. Outside, frost was already forming silver on the pathways. Families huddled together on straw mattresses, sharing body heat under layers of wool blankets and perhaps a fur if they owned one. Sleep came early, for dawn would bring more chores, and winter would only grow harsher. As November drew to a close, the land itself grew still. The last leaves gone, the first dusting of snow whitening the ground in the morning. People cast anxious eyes toward the sky, gauging if those grey clouds carried a storm. They gave thanks for whatever stores they had managed to secure, and whispered prayers that these would be enough. With the Advent season beginning in the church calendar, usually the last days of November or early December, there was also a spiritual preparation, a time of quiet devotion leading up to Christmas, which people hoped to live to see. In small parish churches, Candlelight glinted on cold stone as villagers attended Advent Mass bundled in cloaks, their breath visible in the frigid air indoors. Winter was truly at hand. Transition to December. By the end of November, a thin crust of ice often glazed the edges of ponds each morning. The ground had hardened, and the hollows of fields held frost that didn't thaw even at midday. With their larders stocked as best they could, and their homes battened down, medieval villagers braced themselves for the next phase of the cold season. December was arriving, and with it the darkest weeks of the year, a time of both great solemnity and, paradoxically, moments of celebration around the Yuletide hearth. The candles of Advent had been lit, one by one, in anticipation of Christmas, even as the world outside grew cold and dark. And so, having prepared through November, the village was as ready as it could be to face the deep winter of December. December in the medieval world brought the full force of winter's chill, along with the flicker of holiday fires to ward off the gloom. By now, the countryside was transformed. Morning landscapes were white with frost or blanketed in snow, and a fragile midday sun skimmed low on the horizon. The great binding and freezing of air and water that Bartholomew the Englishman had described was in evidence. Ponds frozen at the edges, hard earth that clanged against the spade. Life moved indoors as much as possible. Villagers ventured outside only for necessary work, tending livestock, fetching water or firewood, and the occasional hunt for fresh food. Otherwise, they stayed near the warmth of their hearths. The experience of December was one of profound cold and darkness, but also of communal closeness. Families and neighbors often crowded together in the warmest space available, perhaps the kitchen hall of a manor for servants, or the single-room cottage of a peasant where humans and a couple of animals shared warmth. Nights were long and often bitterly cold, but the winter sky, when clear, glittered with stars. Indoors, the smell of wood smoke and candle wax became the constant atmosphere of daily life. One of the first tasks on a frigid December dawn was to coax the hearth fire back to life. If the coals had gone out overnight, someone might have to venture to a neighbor's hearth to borrow a glowing ember, or painstakingly strike flint and iron to spark new flame. Keeping that flame alive was literally a matter of life and death in winter. Once the fire crackled, a bit of relief returned to the household. Fingers thawed and faces gained color in the firelight. People warmed leftover pottage for breakfast and thawed any frozen jugs of ale or cider near the flames. Fuel conservation was crucial. They could not burn through their woodpile too fast. Large logs were added sparingly, and families often sat as close to the fire as they could, soaking in its heat. In wealthier homes or monasteries, charcoal braziers might be brought into specific rooms with great caution to provide additional heat. These metal pans, filled with glowing coals, could warm a small area, but they were dangerous. Many a December house fire started from a tipped brazier or a stray spark on rushes. Most peasants did not risk braziers and made do with the single central hearth. Windows, if any, were shuttered or even sealed with parchment or rags to stop draughts. Only the very wealthy had glass in a few windows, and even that thin glass let the cold through easily. To combat the chill, people hung thick woolen or linen curtains over doorways and slept with wool caps on their heads at night. They even heated bricks or stones in the fire, then wrapped them in cloth and tucked them into the foot of the bed to warm the sheets before sleep. Such small comforts were treasured in December. By this time, most of the livestock culling had been completed. November's flurry of slaughter gave way to the slower work of consuming and managing the preserved food. However, not all butchering was done. In many places, the traditional labor of the month for December was the slaughter of pigs, as depicted in illuminated calendars. Indeed, a number of medieval manuscripts show December with the image of peasants butchering a hog under bare trees, a familiar sight. If a household had waited to slaughter a pig in early December, perhaps to let it fatten as long as possible on November's mast, now was the time. In the frosty morning, a family would lead the pig out, often restraining it near a tree stump. Amid much squealing and commotion, the deed was done swiftly, with a knife to the throat, and the warm blood collected in a pan, destined to become blood-pudding sausages later that day. Village neighbors frequently helped each other on butchering days, not only to share the labor of scolding, scraping, and cutting up the carcass, but also to all partake in the slaughter feast. This was the small celebration that accompanied a pig killing. Fresh pork bits, like liver or tenderloin, might be roasted immediately for everyone who assisted. And there was usually a pitcher of ale or cider passed around. It was a bright spot of plenty in an otherwise austere time. After the camaraderie, the real work commenced, processing the pig for preservation. Men and women together tackled different tasks. One salted hams and flitches of bacon, rubbing them with salt, and sometimes spices and honey, before hanging them to smoke. Another cleaned and prepared the intestines to make sausage casings. Another chopped and rendered fat into lard. Sausages were stuffed with a mixture of ground pork, salt, herbs, and blood to make black puddings, which would be cooked and eaten within a few days, often shared around the village as they spoiled quickly. By the end of that day, the pig that had been oinking in the pen that morning was transformed into a pantry of resources: strings of sausage, crocks of lard, smoked bacon, salted hams, and perhaps a brine barrel for pickled pork. This cache would be carefully rationed out in the coming months. Pork was especially welcome in winter, not only for its taste, but because bacon grease could substitute for butter when dairy cows went dry. Medieval people noted that over the winter months, bacon fat largely replaced butter as the main cooking fat. For peasants, fresh meat in December was a luxury to enjoy around Christmas time. Often they timed one of their slaughters, be it a pig, a calf, or some poultry, to provide a feast at Christmas. A common practice was to butcher the fattest pig a few days before Christmas, so that the fresh meat was at its peak for the holy day. In a humble cottage on Christmas Eve, you might find a family boiling a chunk of pork with cabbage, or roasting it on a spit if they had one. The delicious aroma of roasting meat and dripping fat would fill the small room, a rare, rich scent after weeks of primarily vegetable fare. They might also bake special bread from the finest flour they had, or spice a bit of wine or ale as a festive drink if they could afford spices like cinnamon or ginger. In the great halls of the nobility, of course, December brought extravagant feasts with multiple courses of game, roast beef, birds like swan or peacock, and elaborate pies. The contrast was stark. While a peasant family might humbly thank God over a bowl of pork stew and coarse bread, the lord in his castle was enjoying minstrels and mummers entertaining during a 12-day festival of feasting. But in both cases, the spirit of Christmas brought cheer and a break from routine. Throughout early to mid-December, leading up to Christmas, the daily life of peasants remained focused on survival tasks. Yet there was an undercurrent of anticipation. The Church's season of Advent was a time of fasting and reflection, not as strict as Lent, but meat was limited on certain days, so people were spiritually primed for a celebration by the time Christmas arrived. They decorated their churches and sometimes their homes with evergreen boughs, holly, ivy, mistletoe, and pine, symbols of life enduring through winter's death. On street. Nicholas's Day, December 6th. Some communities held small gift-giving traditions, especially to children or the poor, foreshadowing later Christmas customs. Children might set out shoes hoping street Nicholas would leave a little treat, perhaps a few nuts or dried apples. Such customs varied by region, but they added a bit of joy to the dark days. As the winter solstice passed, around December 21st, people noted that the sun's rebirth had begun, though the hardest part of winter still lay ahead. It was no coincidence that Christmas, celebrating the birth of Christ, the light of the world, fell just after the solstice, when daylight would slowly start to increase. In Scandinavia and other parts of northern Europe, older pagan traditions of Yule melded with Christmas celebrations. The Norse Yule was historically a multi-day midwinter festival, and even by medieval Christian times, echoes of it persisted. For example, some families might burn a Yule log, a massive log set on the hearth on Christmas Eve, meant to burn for many hours, or even all 12 days of Christmas, as a sign of goodwill and warmth to carry them through the longest nights. Storytellers would say that the Yule log's embers could ward off evil spirits and misfortune. In great halls, a huge log was ceremonially kindled with wine and greenery and then pushed into the fireplace amid singing. In humble homes, a simpler version was done, but always with gratitude for the light and heat it provided. Christmas Day, December 25th, dawned cold and crisp. Families rose early in the dark to attend the midnight or dawn mass if possible, wrapping themselves in every garment they had to trudge to the village church. The church would be chilly. Most medieval churches were unheated stone buildings, but candles on the altar and the presence of many bodies gave some warmth. The service was joyous. Latin hymns echoed in the arched nave, and perhaps the local lord had donated some extra candles or oil to truly brighten the sanctuary for the occasion. After Mass, the real feasting began. Peasants returned home to enjoy their carefully saved treats. A fat goose or capon might be roasting on a spit for those who had managed to keep poultry fed until now. Geese were commonly slaughtered at Martinmas too, but sometimes one was reserved for Christmas. If not, a portion of salted meat might be boiled with spices to make it palatable, or meat pies might be baked. They likely indulged in butter and cheese on this day, even if those were rationed, breaking the Advent fast gladly. Households broke out their best ale that had been fermenting from the grain harvest, or last autumn's cider, to raise a toast. In many manorial villages, the Lord would provide something for his tenants at Christmas time, perhaps a cask of ale in the courtyard for all to share, or permission for the villagers to gather in the great hall for a meal of bread and stew, seasoned with the Lord's generosity. Caroling, though not quite as we know it, might occur. Groups of villagers, especially the youth, going door to door singing traditional songs in exchange for a cup of ale or a small food gift. This was an early form of wassailing, spreading cheer and also making sure everyone had something to eat and drink. For a brief time, the social order relaxed a little. The 12 days of Christmas, December 25th to January 6th, were a period of allowed merriment. Work was minimized. Only vital tasks were done as needed. People visited each other, shared food, and huddled together against the cold, enjoying the company. Throughout these days, nights were at their longest and darkest, but they were also filled with the warmth of gatherings. In a peasant home during the 12 days of Christmas, after the modest feasting, evenings might be spent in almost celebratory idleness. A grandfather might poke the fire and launch into telling old tales, legends of saints or folk tales of ancient heroes, while the children, drowsy from a full belly, curled up at his feet. The wind could howl outside, but indoors the atmosphere was one of contentment, a rare feeling in the midst of winter's hardships. Candles burned a bit longer than usual on these holy nights, and people felt a measure of hope rekindle in their hearts along with the lengthening days. Still, reality returned once, Twelfth Night, January 5th, and Epiphany, January 6th, passed. By early January, the feasting was over. The extra meat from Christmas was gone or preserved, and everyone had to tighten belts once more. December's end would have also seen the last of certain provisions. For example, hard cheeses and salted butter, made earlier in autumn, might be consumed heavily during the holiday, leaving little to carry forward. What fresh fruits had been stored, a basket of apples or pears in the cold loft, were probably shriveling by now, or had been baked into treats for Christmas. December was a month of contrasts, moments of plenty and celebration set against a backdrop of cold and scarcity. It tested communities in different ways, through the physical challenge of keeping warm and fed, and through the social challenge of ensuring that even the poorest among them did not perish from want. In many places, lords were expected to be charitable at Christmas, distributing alms or food. The church, too, urged care for the needy, especially in this sacred season. We can imagine that on Christmas, in a small village, a family that had been better off after harvest might quietly leave a loaf of bread or some smoked fish at the doorstep of a struggling neighbor, embodying the spirit of the season. As December waned, the weather often grew colder. It was now deep winter. The shortest day of the year had passed, but in practical terms, January would be just as dark and perhaps even more cold. The snow that fell in December sometimes stayed on the ground for weeks, winds piling it into drifts against hedges and cottage walls. Travel was exceedingly difficult. A trader or messenger on the road in late December risked being stranded by snowstorms or finding inns with scant provisions. In the Alps or in Scandinavia, mountain passes and remote roads were closed entirely by snow. Communities there would be isolated until spring thaws. But human resilience shone in these conditions. People adapted means of travel, like sledges and skis in the far north. In Norway, Sweden, and across the Nordic world, skis had been used for millennia. Medieval Scandinavians could ski after their game, or use sleds to transport wood and hay over the snow. Western Europeans, by contrast, did not commonly ski. An English or French peasant simply trudged in boots through snow or stayed put until it melted, which made them marvel at tales of Nordic skiers. During the high holidays of Christmas, most people did not venture far from home anyway. They were content to remain by the hearth, savouring the small joys of the season. Transition to January. As the last days of December slipped by, medieval folk faced the new year, which, by modern reckoning, began January 1st, though many still considered March 25th the year's start. In their terms, the year's turning was less of a party and more of a quiet hope. They hoped the worst of winter would be merciful and that they would live to see the spring planting. The revelry of Christmastide gradually faded. On the 12th night, any remaining Yuletide greenery adorning the halls was taken down and burned in the hearth, its brief life as decoration done. The village now steeled itself for the long, hard slog of January and February, typically the coldest and hungriest time, the celebration was over. Survival mode resumed in earnest. With one last look at the embers of the Yule log, families whispered prayers for endurance. They knew January's deep freeze was coming, and they would need every ounce of strength and solidarity to get through it. January in the medieval calendar was the very heart of winter, a month of heavy frosts, biting winds, and a landscape often stripped to black and white. The images for January in illuminated manuscripts typically show people doing what everyone most longed to do this time of year, warming themselves by the fire and feasting in relative comfort. Indeed, January was frequently depicted as a time of indoor respite following the food preparations of late fall and the festivities of Christmas. In reality, for most people, January brought a mix of needed rest from farming labor and inescapable daily chores that even the cold could not pause. The fields may have been quiet under snow, but a medieval household was never completely idle. Every day, the animals needed tending, cows to be fed and mucked out, remaining pigs or sheep to be checked, chickens to be given whatever grain could be spared so they wouldn't starve. The weather in January was often the harshest of the year. In northern Europe and higher elevations, deep snow might cover the ground continuously. Chronicle accounts speak of rivers frozen solid in severe January cold, of blizzards that howled for days, and of people becoming isolated in their hamlets. Even on more moderate days, the sun, low in the sky, provided little warmth. A phrase from those times goes, "As the day lengthens, the cold strengthens," meaning that even though January's days very gradually became longer than December's, the temperatures tended to drop further. In an English village, one might see icicles hanging thick from the eaves of cottages, and villagers scattering straw or chaff on icy pathways to avoid slipping. In the morning, the ground would be iron hard, the well buckets ropes stiff with frost, and any water left in pails overnight frozen over. People learned to adjust their routines. Chores were done quickly to minimize time outside, and work that could be done in sheltered spots was moved indoors or to the barn. A typical January morning for a peasant family began in darkness. The rooster might crow later than in summer, as if reluctant to start the frigid day. The father or oldest son would rise and break the ice on the water troughs for the animals, steam rising as the thirsty beasts drank. Someone else might be tasked with going to the well. Drawing water in winter was a dreaded job because the iron handle was so cold it could stick to skin. People often wrapped their hands in bits of cloth or worn-out wool when handling cold metal tools or buckets. After these few necessary outdoor tasks at first light, everyone retreated inside, grateful to see the hearth still glowing faintly if they banked it well overnight. Adding kindling and wood, they nursed the fire back to brightness. With luck, a few coals still smouldered, saving them the ordeal of striking flint and steel to spark a new flame in the cold. Once the fire was revived, the family could break their fast with something warm. Most likely, they ate leftover pottage or a porridge of grains boiled in water. On better days, there might be a bit of milk to make a more nourishing gruel. But in deep winter, many cows stopped giving milk, especially if they were expecting calves in spring. Goat's milk or sheep's milk, if those animals had been kept, might still be available in small quantities, but it was common that dairy was very scarce in midwinter. Butter and cheese made in summer had been consumed or had to be rationed carefully. After breakfast, the family turned to indoor tasks and handicrafts. Winter, and January in particular, was known as the time for little works. those maintenance and craft tasks that could be postponed no longer now that field labor was on pause. For instance, threshing grain was often done in winter. If the harvest had been stored as whole sheaves of wheat or other cereal, the peasants gradually threshed them on the barn floor through the winter months. 2 or 3 people might spend hours with flails beating the dry sheaves to knock the grain kernels free of the chaff. It was tiring work, but it kept them warm with physical movement and could be done under cover of the barn roof, out of the wind. The steady thud of flails might be a common sound on clear January days, echoing from one farm to the next. The separated grain would then be winnowed, tossed in large baskets for the breeze, or an indoor draught, to blow away the light chaff, leaving the heavier, edible grain behind. This process produced clouds of dust and chaff, often sticking to the sweaty brows of the workers. But threshing was essential to process the harvest into usable food and seed, and winter gave time for it. Meanwhile, women and older family members often engaged in textile work in January. With less daylight, tasks like spinning, weaving, and sewing often stretched into the evening by firelight. A distaff and spindle were familiar tools in every household. Women spun wool into yarn during spare moments, and in winter they could devote more hours to it. The newly spun yarn might be knitted into woolen stockings, hats, or gloves to replace those worn thin by constant use. If a household was fortunate enough to have a loom, weaving could be done in winter to make new cloth for clothes or to trade. Even without a loom, people crafted garments. They sewed together furs and skins from the recent slaughters, for example. A peasant who had trapped some rabbits or hares might tan the hides and then line his threadbare winter coat with the fur for extra warmth. Fur was not solely the realm of the nobility. While nobles flaunted costly furs like sable and ermine, common folk used what they could obtain, such as rabbit, hare, fox, lamb, or cat skins, to edge their cloaks or make mittens. In fact, an English law in 1363 explicitly allowed the lower classes to wear only the cheaper furs, like lamb and rabbit, reserving the finer ones for the rich. So in January, a village might smell the odd pungency of small-scale tanning. Some families still process their own hides in primitive ways, using urine or brains of the animal to soften and cure the leather. It was unpleasant work, best done away from the main living quarters, but a set of leather shoes or a fur-lined hood resulting from it was worth the effort. Though farm work slowed, some outdoor tasks persisted even in January whenever weather allowed. Firewood collection was continuous. Whatever had been stockpiled was precious. Yet if a thaw or clear day came, men would venture out to gather more deadwood. In forests, truly large logs might be left for later seasons, but fallen branches and underbrush could be collected any time. If the ground was snow-covered, they sometimes harnessed a horse or ox to a sledge to drag wood over the snow, which was easier than using a wheeled cart. Wood that was freshly cut was stacked to dry for future winters, whereas they tried to burn older, dried wood now. Charcoal making, a practice of slow-burning wood to create charcoal fuel, could also occur in winter if someone in the village was skilled at it. The charcoal burners tended their mounds even in winter forests, providing a supply of hotter burning fuel for blacksmiths or those who could afford it. Hunting and trapping in January took on a new urgency as other fresh food sources dwindled. For nobles, January hunts might target large game like red deer or wild boar, only if any boars still roamed after the Advent hunt in December. These hunts, done on horseback with packs of hounds, were dangerous on icy terrain but provided sport and a feast. For peasants, however, hunting was a quieter, more desperate affair. Poaching was a temptation. A deer caught in the Lord's forest could feed a family tremendously, but the risks of harsh punishment were high if caught. More commonly, peasants set traps for small game. In the snowy January woods, one could find hare tracks and set snares along their runs. Snares, made of thin cord or wire, could catch rabbits and hares by the neck or foot. Birds, too, were targets. Traps and nets might be laid for pheasants, partridges, or wild ducks near frozen ponds. The birds tended to flock to any remaining open water or feeding ground, so knowing those spots was key. Some ingenious methods included birdlime, a sticky substance, smeared on branches to capture small birds that landed, or simply knocking roosting pigeons from a dovecote at night. In January, any additional protein was welcome. A brace of rabbits or a fat pheasant could mean the difference between an adequate supper and gnawing hunger. Fishing could be extremely difficult in midwinter, but not impossible. If rivers were not fully frozen, some hardy souls might cast nets for winter fish, like pike or eels, lurking in the mud. Eels could often be caught in winter by spearing into the riverbed. In places with frozen lakes, ice fishing techniques existed. In Scandinavia especially, fishermen would cut holes in lake ice and lower baited lines or nets, sometimes using ingenious methods to thread nets under the ice. Coastal communities still ventured out when the weather permitted. On calmer days, fishermen went to sea to catch herring or cod, though the winter storms on the ocean were perilous. Salted fish from previous months was a staple of winter diet, especially during fasting times, and January might see the last of the stored dried fish being consumed. Within the village, social life in January grew quieter, but not silent. People still had to interact, whether at the mill, the bake oven, or church on Sundays. When folk gathered, they often commiserated about the cold. Neighbours might inquire how each other's food stores were holding up, sometimes in a roundabout way. If one family's ale had run out, for instance, they might trade a portion of their smoked meat with a neighbour who still had malt and yeast to brew. Thus both families benefited. Barter and mutual aid were crucial in these deep winter weeks. The blacksmith might accept a sack of turnips as payment for repairing a cracked pot or sharpening an axe, since coin was scarce and turnips might be more immediately valuable in January. The sense of community responsibility was, in some ways, heightened by the weather. Everyone understood that anyone could fall into dire need if, say, their cottage burned down, or if someone fell ill and couldn't tend the fire or animals. In such cases, the community often rallied to help, at least minimally, recognizing the shared struggle against winter. The health of villagers in January was a concern too. Cold-related ailments were common: chilblains, painful, swollen sores on extremities from cold, frostbite in severe cases, and respiratory illnesses from constant smoke inhalation in enclosed spaces. Coughs and fevers could spread in the close quarters where many people slept together for warmth. There were folk remedies to try: herbal infusions of horehound or thyme for coughs, warming poultices of mustard on cold limbs to stimulate blood. But with no real concept of germs, treatment focused on balancing the body's humours and staying warm and dry. Midwinter was especially hard on the elderly and very young. Many medieval sources symbolically associated January with old age. One reason is that the infirm often did not survive the winter. A weak elder who caught a bad chill or fell ill in January might quietly pass away in their sleep. The community would then carry the body across the frozen ground to the churchyard, the grave digging made arduous by the hard earth. It was a sober reminder to all of winter's toll. Despite these hardships, January was not without its small joys and diversions. One oft-depicted pastime was sitting by the fire telling stories. With long evenings, storytelling became a cherished form of entertainment and education. Grandparents would recount local legends, saints' lives, or perhaps events from their youth. I remember the great freeze of 13, when even the mill pond turned to stone. Children listened wide-eyed, and adults might momentarily forget the ache in their fingers from the cold. Additionally, historical records and art hint that winter games occurred when conditions allowed. For instance, there are accounts of people engaging in snowball fights during medieval winters. One lovely illumination from Burgundy, around 1460, actually shows men and women gleefully throwing snowballs in a town square. We can imagine village youths, after a fresh snowfall, starting a playful fight, their laughter steaming in the cold air, a brief respite from daily cares. Likewise, ice skating was known at least by using animal bones strapped to shoes. It was especially popular in the Netherlands and Scandinavia. An English chronicler in the 12th century even described youths in London skating on frozen marshes with bone skates. So if a local pond froze smooth and thick, some daring youngsters might slide across it or race each other on improvised skates or simply on their boots. These simple recreations brought bursts of energy and happiness to break up winter's monotony. Another quiet delight of January was the sight of lengthening daylight. Though the cold was at its peak, by late January, people could perceive that sunset was a little later than it had been in mid-December. Perhaps the extra quarter hour of light was spent to finish an outdoor task without a torch, or simply noticed by a housewife who realized she could still see her spindle by the window at an hour that had been dark a few weeks before. This subtle return of the light gave hope. It meant that, eventually, spring would come. In church, on the Feast of Candlemas, on February 2nd, coming soon, the clergy would bless all the candles for the year, a symbolic act of bringing light into the dark time, and many believed it also marked the pivot towards spring. Indeed, weather lore held that a bright Candlemas day meant winter would linger, an early version of Groundhog Day prediction, whereas a cloudy, stormy Candlemas meant winter was breaking. So as January drew to a close, people looked toward that date with a mixture of superstition and optimism. Transition to February. The last days of January were often the coldest, as if winter must assert its authority before relenting. At night, the stars sparkled like ice crystals, and every sound, a distant wolf's howl or the cracking of a frozen tree branch, carried through the still, frigid air. Inside the cottages, families piled on the straw and blankets, keeping their children and elderly close. They had passed the midpoint of winter now, and February beckoned with its own set of tasks and trials. By February, subtle changes would stir, a hint of milder air on some afternoons, or the early swelling of buds on bare branches. But winter was by no means done. As one proverb went, February filled dike, black or white, expecting the month to fill the ditches with either rain or snow. The community steeled itself for a few more hard weeks, yet the thought of spring planting and green shoots was enough to kindle an ember of hope. With that hope in mind, they banked the hearth one last time in January and prepared to greet February's uncertain days. February, in the medieval cycle, was a month of paradox. It remained undeniably winter, cold, often snow-laden, and lean in provender, yet it also brought the first subtle hints that the world was stirring towards spring. For the people enduring this time, February tested their endurance, stretching their food supplies and fuel reserves to their limits. At the same time, it demanded that they begin the initial labors for the new agricultural year whenever weather allowed. In art, February is sometimes depicted with peasants out in the fields again, pruning or spreading manure on a clear day, and at other times it's shown like January, huddled by the fire if the snow is deep. The reality depended greatly on region and weather. Western Europe's climate could make February a month of heavy rains and thawing slush, or a continuation of January's freezes. In some southern areas, almond trees might even bloom in late February, whereas in the north, blizzards could still rage. At dawn on a February day, a villager peering outside might see ground covered by a fresh fall of snow, softening the shapes of the world, or just as likely, a swamp of half-frozen mud if a brief thaw had set in. The term February Fildike was apt. It was known as a month when precipitation of one kind or another tended to fill the ditches with water, whether from melted snow or new rain. This often meant the countryside was sodden and difficult to traverse. Boots sank into muck, wagon wheels got stuck. And yet, work had to resume. Unlike December and January, which offered little opportunity for fieldwork, February signaled the start of the new agricultural cycle in many places. Farmers looked to their fields and knew that as soon as the ground was soft enough to work, but not too waterlogged or frozen, they must begin ploughing and sowing for spring crops. Medieval farming manuals advised spreading manure on the fields in late winter to prepare the soil. So, on days when the snow had melted off and the soil was visible, villagers with ox carts would trundle loads of manure, composted animal dung, and bedding straw out to the fields. Spreading manure was a common February task, a smelly but vital chore to fertilize the land. Dressed in layers of ragged wool, a farmer trudged along flinging dark compost with a wooden fork, steam rising from the patties in the cold morning. It was heavy labor that warmed him internally even as the chill wind bit at his cheeks. If the ground was still too hard to absorb the manure, he might delay a bit, but the goal was to have the fields enriched and ready by the time ploughing could start in earnest. Ploughing itself sometimes began in late February on light soils or in milder climates. In southern Europe, say parts of Spain or Italy, February could actually be part of the growing season. Wheat sown in autumn was already sprouted in green carpets across the fields, needing weeding or tending, and new plantings of spring crops might start by month's end. In more northern climes, the plough might not cut soil until March, but a wise farmer used February to prepare his plough and tools. Ploughshares, the iron tips, were taken to the blacksmith for sharpening. Harnesses for the oxen were checked for cracks or weakness and repaired with scraps of leather. Any wooden handles on rakes, forks, or spades that had broken were whittled anew. This was also time to examine the seed grain set aside for spring planting. Families guarded their seed stock carefully all winter. It was often stored in a dry loft, separate from the grain they ate. In February they might bring some out, winnow it again to remove any mouldy or insect-damaged kernels, and prove the seeds, test germination, by sprouting a few on a damp cloth by the hearth. This simple test could tell them if their seed was still viable after months in storage. If germination was poor, they might beg or barter for some seed from a neighbor, rather than waste time planting duds. Such decisions in late winter could make the difference in next year's harvest. Food stores in February were running conspicuously low. The full heartiness of winter holiday eating was past, and Lent, the great fasting season, either arrived during this month or was fast approaching, depending on the year's calendar. Indeed, Medieval people often remarked that the worst hunger was not in winter, but in early spring. By February, stocks of meat and grain had dwindled to a worrying degree for many families. Barrels once brimming with salt meat now rattled with just a few pieces left in brine. The smoked sausages and hams hung in the rafters were fewer. Each week one might be taken down, and when they were gone, they were gone. Many households were now almost entirely on peasant fare. Coarse bread, pottage of dried beans or peas, and maybe some stored root vegetables. The cellared carrots, parsnips, turnips, and onions were nearing the end of their storage life. In the damp of winter cellars, rot could claim a portion of them. Cabbages buried under straw might still be there, though often half decayed and sour. Those were thrown into the stew pot with a bit of salt, or used to make a simple sauerkraut, if that local tradition existed. The hungry gap, that perilous period when winter stores were nearly exhausted, but new crops had yet to be harvested, was beginning. It would peak in March and April, but February was the prelude. This hardship conveniently coincided with Lent, which in many years began in February, as early February, or as late as early March. During Lent, by church law, people were forbidden to eat meat, eggs, or dairy on most days. They subsisted on bread, vegetables, and fish if available. From a practical standpoint, this aligned with the reality that by late winter, most families had little meat or dairy left anyway. Cows and goats that hadn't freshened, given birth, produced almost no milk now. Hens sensitive to daylight hardly laid any eggs during the short days, though by late February, as days lengthened, the hens might just begin to lay a few again. But those first eggs were often saved for Easter, as eating them during Lent was not allowed. So one can imagine the fare on a February evening: a thick soup of peas, and perhaps a handful of dried herbs gathered last summer, served with a heel of rye bread, washed down with weak ale, brewed thin to stretch grain supply. It was bland, repetitive, but filling enough if one had enough stores. For those who did not, hunger bit deeply. Some poorer peasants resorted to stretching their flour with ground acorns or nuts, or gathering new shoots of wild herbs, called pot herbs, that just began to emerge at winter's end. Nettles, wild sorrel, crow garlic, these might start poking out in sheltered spots by late February. They were bitter greens, but after months of dried food, the body craved any fresh growing thing. People would boil these herbs into soups, or add them to doughs. This was a precarious time nutritionally. Vitamin deficiencies, like scurvy from lack of vitamin C, often set in by late winter in northern regions. Gums would bleed, and wounds healed poorly. Many simply endured it, not knowing the cause, only that spring greens and leeks when they came would make them feel better. Despite the scarcity, February brought its share of communal observances. On February 2nd came Candlemas, a significant day both religiously and in folk tradition. Candlemas, Feast of the Purification, was when the Church blessed all the candles for the year and commemorated an event in Christ's infancy. People brought candles to church to be blessed. Important when candles were a primary source of light. In some English sayings, Candlemas was also a time to take down any remaining Christmas greens, as any foliage left up beyond that date was considered bad luck. There was a superstition, as mentioned before, that fair weather on Candlemas meant a long winter, whereas foul weather meant winter was soon to end. A rhyme went, "If Candlemas day be fair and bright, winter will have another flight. If Candlemas day be clouds and rain, winter is gone and will not come again." So villagers covertly watched the weather on February 2nd, hoping for a cloudy, damp day to prove that spring was near. If it instead dawned sunny and clear but cold, they resigned themselves to more weeks of bitter weather. This bit of Groundhog Day-like prognostication gave them at least a sense of anticipation, something to gossip about by the well or after Mass. Following Candlemas, another occasion often enlivened late winter, Carnival, the days of merriment just before Lent, which usually begins on a Wednesday, Ash Wednesday. In many medieval towns, and even some rural villages, the 3 days before Lent, Shrovetide, were a time of prescribed fun and indulgence. On Shrove Tuesday, people would consume the last of their butter, sugar, and eggs, hence the tradition of pancakes on that day in some countries, since those would be forbidden in Lent. We can imagine a peasant housewife in early February carefully hoarding a few eggs that her hens finally laid as the daylight grew, to mix with the last drippings of bacon fat and a cup of milled oats to fry little griddle cakes for her family as a treat. Children might have been excited for this, knowing it could be the richest food they taste until Easter. In parts of France or Italy, Carnival involved community plays, costumed processions, or a bit of role reversal, the famous Feast of Fools, where commoners could parody their superiors safely. Even in a small village, there might be a brief dance or a mock fight game on the green, if weather permitted, as a way to blow off steam before the somber season of fasting. These cultural traditions varied widely, but they served to lift morale in the dead of winter. Throughout February, clothing and warmth remained paramount concerns. Whatever firewood remained had to be eked out. Families often did not keep the fire roaring all day. Fuel was too precious. Instead, they might let it die to embers and then revive it for cooking or for the evening gathering, when the cold was most intense. People spent more time in the barn or byre with the animals on frigid days, as those spaces, filled with cows, sheep, or goats, were surprisingly warmer. The body heat and breath of animals took the edge off the chill. In some regions, houses were built attached to or above the animal stable for this very reason, to let the warmth of livestock rise into the living quarters. A medieval observer in the Alps might note families literally living over the cow stable in winter, with a trapdoor to drop hay to the cows and to receive warmth in return. In Scandinavia, houses were built low and insulated, with thick timber walls or even earth to preserve heat. They used furs abundantly, not as display, but as necessity. People in those latitudes also were adept at travelling over snow and ice. February, in Norway or Sweden, would see folk strapping on skis or snowshoes to go between homesteads or to hunt, something their English counterparts did not do. In fact, Northern Europeans had developed various forms of skis, some long for distance, some short for manoeuvring in woods. If you were a traveller from a milder climate, seeing a Nordic farmer glide over the snow on wooden slats, leading a sled of firewood, you'd be astonished. But that was how they coped. Western Europeans mostly struggled on foot in snow, using sledges only with animal power, and thus found themselves homebound, more often in deep winter. Pruning and planting tasks were another sign of late winter. Many fruit trees, such as vineyards and orchards, benefited from pruning in the dormant season. Historical guides suggest that February was a time to prune vines and trees on milder days. Thus, an orchard keeper would bundle up and head to his apple trees with a sharp knife, cutting away dead or excess branches. It seems counterintuitive to be in a snowy orchard cutting a living tree, but this ensured better growth come spring. Likewise, new vine cuttings could be planted in late winter thaws. Folks would push vine cuttings into the soil, hoping they'd take root when warmth returned. Some calendars depict February with exactly such scenes. A man with a pruning hook at a vineyard, sometimes shown with snow still on the ground. This reminds us that not every day was brutally cold. There were always a few mild spells when the sun felt almost spring-like. On those days, the entire village seized the chance to do outdoor work and also to soak in a bit of sun on their faces, likely cheering their spirits. As February drew to a close, the change in season grew palpable. By the last week, days were notably longer than at Christmas. Dawn came earlier, sunset later. The quality of light changed, a little brighter, a little more golden on clear afternoons. Birds, sensing the shift, started to sing again. It might just be the hardy sparrows or a robin poking about near the thawing edges of a hedge, but their chirping was a welcome sound after the winter silence. Children would delight to see the first snowdrops or crocuses pushing through the snow near the churchyard, tiny white and purple flags of hope. There is an old saying, February burrs, March stirs, meaning February still shivers with cold, but March begins to wake things up. True enough, by late February, the stirrings of early spring were underway. Ewes, female sheep, and nanny goats often gave birth around this time, since mating occurred the previous fall. So one of the sweetest sights in a medieval village, as winter waned, was the emergence of the first woolly lambs and goat kids. Weak and wobbly, they stayed in the barn close to mother, but within days they'd be prancing in the straw. For a peasant, those newborn animals meant new milk would soon flow after the young had their share. Warm goat's milk or sheep's milk, even in small amounts, was a tonic after months without fresh dairy. They might make a little fresh cheese, a simple curd cheese, not a feast, but so creamy and flavorful compared to the hardened old cheeses left from last year. It was a promise of more to come. However, these births also meant extra work and concern. The young animals needed to be kept warm. Shepherds sometimes kept lambs by the hearth if it was an especially cold night, much to the amusement or exasperation of the rest of the household. But losing a newborn to cold was an economic blow, so they did what they must. By the time March approached, villagers quietly took stock of their situation. If they had made it through February with some food still left and all family members alive and reasonably healthy, they breathed a cautious sigh of relief. They knew the toughest stretch was nearly behind them. One more month of winter now, albeit a capricious one. In their minds, they were likely already planning the spring work, which field to till first, how many seeds they could sow, whether to acquire another piglet at the spring market to raise for next year's slaughter. Such hopeful thoughts helped carry them forward. But first, they would have to navigate March, a month of transition and often unpredictable weather. As the proverb goes, March can come in like a lion with storms and go out like a lamb with gentle breezes, or vice versa. One never knew. The medieval farmer stood on the cusp between winter and spring as February ended, praying for gentle weather and a rebirth of the earth. The eve of March might find a family crouched around the hearth, listening to the drip-drip of melting snow from the eaves outside. Perhaps rain pattered on the thatch roof, eroding the last snowbanks and ushering in a raw, damp mildness. They would know then that spring was truly on its way. With a silent toast, maybe a shared cup of the last strong ale, or a spoonful of precious honey if they had it, they bid farewell to the depths of winter. Surviving through November's preparations, December's cold revelry, January's deep freeze, and February's hunger was no small feat. March would bring its own labours, but also the first promise of renewal. and so they banked the fire one final time for the night, a little less worried about it going out. Outside in the dark, a lone frog croaked in a half-thawed marsh, a tiny voice joining the chorus that signaled winter's end. With hearts weary but hopeful, the medieval villagers crossed the threshold into March, ready to welcome the gentle kiss of spring. March arrived with a mix of lingering winter and emerging spring, making it a month of contrasts and cautious optimism. In the medieval conception of the seasons, March was often seen as the end of winter, but not yet the reliable warmth of true spring. The weather could swing wildly. One week a soft, mild breeze and snowdrops in the meadow. The next, a brutal late frost, or even a snow flurry coating the fields again. People in the Middle Ages had many sayings about March's fickleness. In French lands, they said, Mars martèle, March hammers, implying it can still hit hard with cold. In England, they noted, March comes in like a lion and goes out like a lamb, hoping that by the end of the month, gentler days would prevail. Through all these caprices, medieval villagers forged ahead with their spring tasks, fueled by the knowledge that the cycle of life was beginning anew. This was a pivotal time. Surviving winter turned into preparing for growth. There was work to do everywhere, in fields, gardens, and barns, even as everyone's strength was at its lowest ebb from months of scant diets. At dawn, on a March day, the cock's crow might actually precede the sunrise now. As mornings grew lighter, the air had a different scent, still cold, but with a damp freshness, carrying the odor of thawing earth. Mists hung over the fields, and birdsong, true birdsong, began to return with the larks, blackbirds, and thrushes greeting the pale sun. For the first time in months, the ground could be dug and tilled without the blow of a pickaxe to break the frost. Ploughing resumed in earnest as soon as fields were dry enough. Farmers hitched oxen to ploughs and carved through the meadows and fallow plots, turning rich brown soil to the surface. It was hard labor. Ploughmen, often stripped to their shirts, even in chill air from the exertion. And oftentimes the entire family would help, one guiding the plough, another leading the ox, others following to break clods. This was the beginning of the spring planting campaign. They sowed barley, oats, peas, and other spring crops now, casting the seeds by hand across the freshly furrowed ground. A 14th century guide noted March was for digging or pruning, highlighting both field and vine tasks. Indeed, those who had not finished pruning their vineyards or orchards in February rushed to do so in early March, before new buds grew too large. March was also when willow trees could be pollarded, cut back, to spur new shoots for future firewood or basketry. There was a sense of urgency. Every able-bodied person was out gleaning sunlight to catch up on what winter had delayed. While the men ploughed, women took to the gardens. The kitchen garden, lying perhaps within the cottage yard, needed preparing for planting of onions, herbs, and early greens. Women would work compost or ash into the garden beds as fertilizer, often using just a simple spade or even their hands. They sowed hardy seeds like parsley, leeks, and lettuce as soon as weather allowed, sometimes under a bit of straw mulch to protect from late frost. Cabbage seedlings, started in seedbeds late in the winter, might be ready for transplanting into rows. Medieval gardening was low-tech but effective. They knew to use cold frames of sorts, old pieces of glass or horn, if available, set over seedlings to act as primitive greenhouses, and to rotate crops around small plots. Many of these skills, passed down by monastic gardeners and peasant tradition alike, found heavy use in March. Additionally, if the honeybees in Skep's basket hives had survived winter, they would emerge now on warmer days. Beekeepers, often the elderly or priests who kept hives, opened the hives to clean out any dead bees and check stores. Often they fed the bees a bit of honey or diluted mead now to strengthen the colony until flowers bloomed in abundance. The gentle buzz of bees on a March afternoon, visiting the first crocuses or willow catkins, was a welcome sound signaling life stirring. Despite the flurry of outdoor work, March remained a perilous time for provisions. This was truly the hunger gap hitting home. By mid-March, granaries were nearly empty in many households. The lentils, peas, and beans dried from last harvest were mostly gone into countless soups. The barrels of salted meat were likely empty or contained only brine and bones. If a family still had a side of bacon hanging, it was probably cut thin, a slice at a time, to flavor many meals rather than eaten straight. Lent fasting rules, which forbade meat and dairy, actually somewhat masked the desperate lack of those foods. But fish was allowed, and not everyone could get fish. Inland villages depended on salted herring or dried cod from coastal trade for Lent. By March, what little fish supply they had might be spoiled or consumed. Some rivers and streams thawed enough for local fishermen to catch fresh fish, trout or pike in rivers, maybe river eels starting to stir. These would be celebrated catches and likely shared around if abundant. For example, a miller who managed to net some fat river eels might smoke a few and deliver them to the manor house, fulfilling a customary due, and keep the rest for trading with neighbors for bread. Meanwhile, any green edible plant that poked out of the soil was collected fervently. The mention of wild pot herbs in accounts of the hunger gap show that nettles, sorrel, young dandelion, wild leeks, and others were a crucial source of vitamins and flavor now. People made spring tonics, essentially green soups, believing they cleansed the blood of winter impurities. This practice had practical value, as those herbs provided vitamin C and other nutrients to ward off scurvy and boost health. A common dish was nettle pottage. Boil nettle leaves. The sting goes away when cooked. With a bit of barley or oats and onion. It might be slimy and bitter, but to a nutrient-starved body, it felt reviving. In some regions, March was known as the starving month. Chroniclers note that the poor often went begging in early spring, their own stores exhausted. Some resorted to eating tree bark or roots in extreme famine, though normally communal charity tried to prevent that. Churches distributed alms when they could. On holy days like Good Friday or during Lent, monasteries might give out bread to the destitute. But in a widespread bad year, there might be little surplus to share. Famines in medieval Europe often peaked in the springtime, ironically when nature was about to replenish food. Thus, March was often about grim endurance. Everyone looked to Easter, which could fall in late March or April, with both spiritual joy and the very tangible expectation of a feast to break the fast. Lambing and calving continued through March. By now, many more ewes gave birth, filling pastures with tottering lambs come warmer afternoons. Shepherds, who had spent winter days merely keeping sheep alive on hay, now had to oversee births, sometimes assisting if a lamb was stuck. They often smeared newborn lambs with salt as a folk practice to invigorate them, and perhaps to encourage the ewe to lick them clean vigorously, which improved circulation. With each successful birth, the prospect of milk improved. Sheep's milk, and goat's milk were actually more common for cheese making in some regions than cow's milk. As soon as the lambs and kids could spare a bit, people milked the dams and started making simple fresh cheese or curds. In northern climes, cows were calving too. A cow that calved in March would begin giving rich milk, a boon for her owners. Milking resumed after a long hiatus, and the farm wife could skim cream and even churn a small pat of butter again, likely the first fresh butter since autumn. The taste of that new butter, golden and clean, spread on a hunk of coarse bread, must have been heavenly after the winter of reliance on bacon, grease, or stored lard. Those lucky enough to have a dairy cow celebrated this time, they also knew to be careful. Spring was cold and damp, so newborn animals needed protection from chills to avoid pneumonia. Calves might be stabled with extra dry bedding, and lambs sheltered at night until it grew milder. Foxes, lean from winter, also posed a threat, sneaking closer to homesteads to snatch lambs or chickens. So shepherd boys and dogs kept watch, and farmers set traps near henhouses. Weather events in March varied. There might be what we call the spring equinox storm, a burst of cold squalls around late March. Medieval accounts sometimes mention a Black March, when incessant rains turned everything to mud and rotted seedlings. Conversely, some years' March brought an early gentle spell, known as Lent warming, tricking trees into budding. People were wary of these too early mild spells, for a subsequent freeze, like an Easter frost, could ruin those buds and reduce fruit yields come summer. Life in a medieval village was intimately tied to such nuances of weather. A single cold snap could mean no plums or apples that year, or a failed early sowing. Thus, they often hedged their bets. Sow some seed in March, but keep some to reseed in April if frost killed the first. March also held an important date in many medieval calendars. March 25th, the Annunciation, Lady Day, which, as earlier noted, was treated as New Year's Day in much of Europe. Unlike our modern revelry on January 1st, the medieval New Year on March 25th was a solemn holy day, but it had practical significance too. Many rents, contracts, and obligations were scheduled from Lady Day to Lady Day. In an English manor, for instance, tenant leases often ran starting March 25th. A labourer's year of employment might be counted from that date. In some places, hiring fairs were held around this time, a chance for labourers and servants to find new positions as the agricultural season kicked off. You might see, in a market town in late March, a line of young men and women, each perhaps holding a tool or symbol like a shepherd's crook or a milking stool, indicating their trade, hoping a landowner would hire them for the year. Wages might partly be paid in kind grain, clothing, lodging, given coin was scarce. Lady Day was also one of the quarter days when accounts were settled. A yeoman might travel to the nearest castle to pay his annual rent to the lord, often in silver pennies, or perhaps in chickens or grain if coin was lacking. This made late March a brief, bustling time of administering the necessities of feudal economy after the winter pause and before spring rush fully set in. By late March, spring religious observances also reshaped daily life. If Easter fell in March, which occasionally it did, if the lunar calculations aligned, Holy Week ceremonies broke the routine of work with extra church services, processions, and mystery plays. Palm Sunday might be marked by strewing the church with willow branches, as actual palms were unavailable, and the making of crosses from these palm fronds to hang in homes for blessing. The end of Lent meant people could soon return to a fuller diet, and how eagerly they awaited it. An account from a medieval monastic chronicle humorously notes a monk's diary, where the entries in Lent become increasingly short and irritable until Easter, when they suddenly wax lyrical over the taste of cheese and eggs again. Likewise for peasants, Easter Sunday was a jubilation. After attending a triumphant mass with bells ringing bells, which had been silenced during the sombre last days of Holy Week, they came home to break their fast. Coloured eggs were sometimes blessed and eaten, a symbol of resurrection. There are records of egg decorating in medieval times, especially in Eastern Europe, but even in the West, eggs were a known treat. They might have a fresh-baked loaf using richer dough, perhaps with some butter or milk added, now that those were allowed and becoming available. Any remaining bits of salted meat might be cooked to celebrate the feast. Often lords provided an Easter largesse, maybe extra ale or a communal meal for their serfs, both as a pious act and a pragmatic one, to energize them for the planting ahead. As March came to its close, the transformation of the land was visibly underway. Willow trees sported silvery catkins, alders and hazels showed dangling tassels, catkins releasing pollen, a sure sign that the plant world was waking. Early fruit trees, like cherries or plums, might unfurl their first blossoms if the weather had been warm enough. Those delicate white or pink flowers against brown branches were a hopeful sight to medieval eyes, though fruit blossoms also induced nervous prayers against frost. Grass in the commons began to grow green again, to the delight of sheep and cattle, which were utterly tired of hay. Herds were gradually let out to pasture as soon as there was enough growth. One could almost sense the animals' joy as they nibbled fresh grass after months indoors, chewing dry fodder. This also meant less labour hauling hay to them, a relief for the farmers. The ground, though muddy in places, held promise. Little seedlings of barley and oats poked up in fields sown earlier in the month, forming a faint green haze over the brown earth. In the manor's vineyards, if it was a winemaking region, one might see the first tiny leaf buds emerging on pruned vines by late March. Vine growers often prayed to St. Vincent or other patron saints to protect these buds from inclement weather. Birds and animals followed their ancient rhythms. Larks soared and sang over ploughed fields. Crows gathered sticks to repair their nests. Frogs and toads began croaking in reawakening ponds at twilight. In forests, wolves that had prowled near villages in the dead of winter now retreated as prey animals grew more plentiful in the wild again. The threat to humans lessened with spring's arrival. The last fires of winter, metaphorically speaking, were dying out. People needed their hearths still, certainly, but they could leave the cottage door open a crack in midday to let fresh air in without freezing. Children dared to play outside more, splashing in puddles or chasing early butterflies, likely brimstones or cabbage whites. And so, as medieval winter turned to spring at the end of March, a year's cycle had come full circle. The villagers who had laboured to stockpile food in autumn shivered through the long nights of December, endured the deprivations of January and February, and now coaxed new life from the soil in March, could finally smile at the bright green rebirth around them. They had survived one more winter, a feat never taken for granted. Perhaps on March 25th, as they heard the words of the Angelus bell for Lady Day, they reflected on the renewal and hope inherent in their world. For lo, the winter is past, as an old verse says. The rain is over and gone. The flowers appear on the earth. The time of singing has come. These lines, often read in spring, resonated deeply after the trials of cold and hunger. When the sun set on the final day of March, It was around 12 hours of daylight, a far cry from the stunted light of midwinter. In a humble cottage, the family sat together after a day of strenuous fieldwork, tired but content. A simple stew bubbled in the pot, enriched with some greens from the woods and maybe a dash of that precious new milk. They spoke in low voices about the planting still to do, the calf that needed tending, the upcoming fair at which they might buy a few more piglets with whatever coin they saved. Outside, frogs chorused and a soft spring wind rustled the thatch. Before banking the hearth for the night, they might share a final story or prayer, thanking God for delivering them from another winter's grasp. In the morning, April would dawn, and with it the flowering of the year. The medieval winter, with its cold, uncertain hardships, had been endured through preparation, communal effort, faith, and resilience. Now, life could begin anew in the warmth of spring. Medieval winter was not merely a season. It was a long trial that tested preparation, community, and resilience. From November's careful stockpiling to March's fragile hope, survival depended on knowledge passed down through generations, shared labor, and an unshakable belief that spring would return. Those who endured the cold months did not conquer winter. They learned to live alongside it, one careful day at a time. Thank you for walking month by month through the medieval winter. If this journey carried you into another time, another firelit room, let me know where you were listening from and what hour the night or morning found you. Until our next story, keep warm and let the quiet of history stay with you a little longer.